My name is David Ives. I'm the Executive Director of the Albert Schweitzer Institute at Quinnipiac University here. It's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. I especially want to thank a couple people in the audience who are co-sponsoring this with us. One is Vince Cotrucci, sitting over here. He's the Director of the Office of Community Service and has been invaluable in putting this whole process together. And then probably the most important person to make sure that this whole process worked well is my assistant, Joe Palmieri, in the red in the back. I wanted to point her out and thank her publicly for all the work she did on this. And also to say that she's passed out pencils and a 3x5 card, and we would like you to fill those out briefly just with your reaction to the program tonight, because we're trying to evaluate everything that we do. And we would appreciate it if you would just take the time to fill that out a little bit before you leave, and just drop it outside after the program is over. I run the Albert Schweitzer Institute, and Albert Schweitzer was famous for his Nobel Peace Prize in 1952. He was a doctor, a theologian, a philosopher, and a musician, and an outstanding organist. He was as famous in the last century as Bono is today in this century. In fact, I had an opportunity to tell Bono once that he was the new Albert Schweitzer, and he said, "Cool." That was it, my conversation with him. But nevertheless, Schweitzer promotes the ideas of reverence for life, and that we are all life among other lives struggling to survive. And he felt very strongly that we should think very carefully before we destroy anything in the universe. And so when now I want to come to the part where I kind of talk about how we got the idea of having something on the Emancipation Proclamation, because it fits in with what Schweitzer talks about in his ideas and his philosophies. But about 5 months ago, Mohammed Bey, who was the director of multicultural affairs on campus, said, "Did you know that this is the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation?" And it hadn't hit me at all. It hadn't been in the newspapers. I hadn't seen it online. But it seemed to me like that we should not ignore it. It is one of the most significant documents, historically speaking, I think, of all time, up there with the Magna Carta, Declaration of Independence, and other documents that are very important. So it's our intent to have a series of programs this spring to celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, our next event will be on May 1st, and we're going to show the movie Lincoln at that time and have a discussion about it. So if you want to come and see the movie and have a good discussion about it, I invite you to come. But tonight we're going to take an international look at slavery and some of the issues of how children and women especially are treated around the world. It's a pleasure to have our panelists here. The panelists will include, first of all, Mr. Jeffrey Blom, who's the founder and president of the Global Sentry Group, a not-profit organization that works to reduce the demand for trafficked persons by targeting those who exploit the victims by identifying, mapping, and dismantling their networks. Blom, a former law enforcement professional, is an international human trafficking expert who conducts undercover investigations in developing countries. He will discuss the human trafficking industry, rescues he has conducted, and the prevalence of slavery today. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Sasha Turner. She's an assistant professor of history in the College of Arts and Sciences here at Quinnipiac. She specializes in the Caribbean, slavery, women, gender and sexuality, and the Atlantic world and the African diaspora. Dr. Turner will discuss transnational connections between the British abolitionist movement as the origins of humanitarian activism against slavery and the limitations of emancipation, particularly as it pertains to women, especially in the Caribbean. Lastly, but not least, is Ms. Nina Brandy. She's a Quinnipiac student who volunteers and is a board member at her relatively young age of the Restavik Freedom Alliance, which is dedicated to providing relief for children who are used as slaves in Haiti. Its mission is to offer a safe, family-centered environment for these children. She also went with me to Nicaragua on our spring break trip, and she was just a wonderful participant, and she's very passionate about her work with children in Haiti. So with that, I'd like to have you talk in the order that I introduced you, with Jeffrey Bloom going first, Sasha Turner, and Nina. Can you all welcome our panelists with a round of applause, please?
I want to thank you all for the opportunity to be here tonight, and thank you to the Schweitzer Institute for this invitation to be here and to be able to talk about what has become a very dear and near passion in my life. Prior to 2006, I didn't know much about human trafficking. I worked for an organization called International Justice Mission. You may or may not have heard of it. Worked for them for 5 years, the last 3 as their VP of Investigations. And during those, the last 7 years total, I've worked in over 19 different countries, conducted over 400 investigations, and spoke to nearly 500 victims of trafficking, either while they're in exploitation phases or after we've recovered them. And so I'm going to talk tonight a little bit about modern day slavery. Talk about the real faces and the real places and then the real problem that we have. But first we want to identify what actually is slavery. Slavery is the owning and oppression or exploitation of one human being by another human being. Basically, you're owned by somebody else. You're a commodity or a product. This happens all over the world. You're not free to make a choice. Many slaves are locked up at night. They're chained up during the day while they're working. They're forced to serve their owners, usually against their will. There are such things as debt bondage, where you may get an advance of a little bit of money, equivalent of $25 to $200 US, and then work the next 30 years trying to pay off that debt. Basically, you never will. These slaves are subjected to horrific conditions. They live in squalor, and many times they contract diseases, get injuries, and it's cheaper for the owners to let them die or to kill them and replace them than it is to get medical attention for them. I'm sure we've all seen movies. We've seen Taken. We've seen some of these other movies. We've seen pictures of slaves from the African slave time. But what do the slaves of today look like, really? I'm going to show you some pictures that I've taken either from my undercover videos or from other pictures I've taken during rescues and other operations of real victims of trafficking and slavery. But how long has slavery been around in the world? Well, slavery's been around as long as man has been on the earth. As long as one person has been stronger, smarter, or more powerful than another person to be able to exploit that person and put them into a condition of exploitation or slavery. It's nothing new. It's been around for a long, long time. We've just brought it more to the attention recently with the issues of human trafficking. Talk a little bit about the African slave trade. I'm not an expert on this. And I'm going to say that up front, so I'll let the doctor here talk more in depth. But I'm just going to point out 5 characteristics that we're going to compare the African slave trade to the new slavery today, and some things we can learn from what they did to abolish or to at least minimize the trafficking back then. When did it begin? It began basically in the middle of the 14th century with the Portuguese going down into Africa looking for gold, looking to exploit the minerals down there, and they found something else to exploit while they were down there: humans, slaves. They found that they could make a good profit trafficking or transporting them across to other places and selling them as slaves. Why did it begin? About this time, you had the New World being discovered, colonization of South America and North America. They had agricultural plants, mining industries, and they needed lots of workers to work in those areas. And so they needed a strong labor market. And so there was a big demand. And wherever there's a demand, somebody's going to find a way to supply what they need in demand. And so these African slaves, seemingly unlimited, were then being transported across the ocean to fill these needs of the labor. How many slaves were trafficked to North America? I've seen several reports estimating around 500,000 African slaves were transported to North America during the years of 1450 to 1900. So over 500,000 people were trafficked to North America during that period of time. And how did they get the slaves? From some of the stories I've read, many accounts, they were actually kidnapped. They would have professional kidnappers go into different areas of Africa, identify villages, and go in either while the parents or the adults were out working and kidnap the children and bring them back for sale, or they would actually go into villages, attack villages, take them as prisoners, and transport them usually to the western coast where they had slave markets. They would then put the slaves on sale, sell them to buyers who would then transport them across the Atlantic Ocean, either to Central America, South America, or North America. There are some that were actually deceived, lured away under promises of either work, or even some of the kidnappers themselves, when they were bringing their loads in, were deceived to come on board the ships, and again were captured and trafficked as well. And how did they control them? Always a problem of how do you control these enslaved people? Well, back then, they used force. Force seemed to be an effective way. And so they would first chain them up, bring them together, use chains, other types of restraints, shackles, fetters, transport them inland, usually by walking across to the slave markets. When they were brought on board the ships, they were usually chained together in pairs or more, and then laid in the most economical way to be able to transport the most amount of slaves across. Once they got them across into their destination ports, again, they were chained up, hauled away to where they're going to finally be working in the mines or on farms or plantations, and then usually controlled by force, usually brutal measures such as whippings, beatings. They also use psychological methods as well as the physical force. If someone would try to run away or try to misbehave or something, they would actually brutalize the person in front of the other slaves to psychologically set an example for the other slaves to reduce any resistance to trying to escape and get away. Now let's compare that to what we know of what happens today. So where does slavery exist today? In about every country in the world, there exists some form of slavery. It may take the form of debt bondage, domestic servitude, labor issues. A lot of migrant workers go across and are exploited into labor exploitation. Forced marriages and sexual exploitation are all actually the exploitative phase of the trafficking. That's when they're actually brought into the servitude and oppression. Other ways of exploitation are child soldiers and even trafficking for organs. But in the United States, some form of slavery exists in every state, and some form of trafficking exists in every state. Even here in this city tonight, there's some form of slavery, some form of trafficking happening as we're here giving this presentation tonight. Why does it exist today? Now, this is well beyond the scope of this presentation tonight. It's a very complicated and complex answer. But some of the things we can think about here to truly understand why slavery exists, we've got to dig down into cultural practices and acceptances. In many countries, it may be accepted to sell your 5, 6, 7-year-old daughter as a commodity to help support the family. I've rescued 13, 14-year-old girls who were sold for the purpose to raise money for the family, and they got a monthly income from the sexual exploitation of that 13, 14-year-old. Economic push and pull factors. What is happening in this economy that's going to drive people to go somewhere else to seek better conditions, or what's going to pull them? What's happening in China right now with the one-child policy? These males are getting of marriage age, and there's not enough females because they've aborted or killed all the female children. And so a lot of girls in the Middle East, Eastern Russia, former Soviet bloc countries are being trafficked into China as brides. Also in Russia, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, their economies fell down. There were no jobs for the women. There's a lot of gender inequality that was push factors for the women to go and seek opportunities outside of the communities, outside of their country, and were then vulnerable to being trafficked. Gender bias and inequality, poor or non-existent laws. Up until recently, there were no good laws to be able to combat trafficking or slavery. And then, of course, lack of effective enforcement. We may have good laws on the books, but what are we doing about enforcing those laws and going after the traffickers and the exploiters? And the last thing we got to talk about is apathy. Why aren't we doing something more about this thing? It's been around for years, long before 2000 when we had the PROTECT Act signed here in the United States. Why are we just not doing something about this? It plays a major role, especially overseas when you're dealing with developing countries. And so the question people always ask me is, well, how many people are trafficked or how many people are enslaved? But due to the nature of the crime or due to the nature of the activity, it's a hidden crime and no one knows the exact numbers. We throw out numbers like we really know, and a lot of times we're quoting each other and many times. But I've heard rough estimates, anywhere from 20 to 27 million people are enslaved at any one time. And about 2.4 million people are being trafficked yearly around the world. I think to put that in comparison, it's like 1.6 times the size of New Haven, or this metropolitan area. With all the knowledge and all the understanding and all the education and awareness of trafficking and slavery, how do these traffickers get their victims? Well, it's in the African slave trade. Some victims are actually kidnapped. A very small percentage, but some are forcibly kidnapped. I was working in Las Vegas earlier this year and heard stories and actually got reports of young girls being actually stolen off the streets of the Strip out there, kidnapped, usually by Asian gangs, and forced into prostitution. It does still happen. But a majority of the victims are recruited through deception. I'd say about 90% of the girls I've talked to overseas and even here in the US were responding to ads for either modeling or domestic work, or working in restaurants or other opportunities. These girls are seeking a better economic opportunity and they're vulnerable. I met a girl from Georgia, the country of Georgia, when I was in Greece. 23-year-old woman, educated, advanced degree, working in a tax office, was deceived and lured into Greece and sold into the sex trafficking market until she finally escaped and got away. And so it can happen to anybody. Anybody who's vulnerable looking for a better opportunity. But the victims first are either kidnapped or deceived and then transported, usually willingly. If they're deceived, they're willingly going along. If it's transnational crime, they'll get a passport, they'll get their documentation, they'll be taken across the border legally, and then once they get across, the traffickers will seize their documents, lock them up, and then sell them off to their areas of exploitation or traffic them to their own brothels or bars or wherever they're going to use them. Or if it's labor exploitation, to the locations where they're going to be exploited for labor. After that, it's similar to that the exploiters will use many ways to control the victims. And so how do they control the victims of today? The traffickers and the exploiters, unfortunately, are getting smarter. When I started doing this work years ago, they were using force. They would force the women, they would beat them, they would abuse them, they'd lock them up. And they found out that more of the girls tried to escape. The more force they used, the more they tried to escape. And so now they're using different tactics. They're using more of obligation. They say, well, you owe us this debt, the illusion of debt. They're using psychological techniques, even trauma bonding with the victims and the perpetrators to get them to stay. Many girls will sit there and say, okay, I've got to pay this debt off, then I can get out. They don't realize that they've been trafficked, they're sold, they're slaves. They don't have to be there. They don't have this debt incurred. But they do believe it. Here in the U.S., love interest is a major recruiting tool. A pimp or a trafficker will get a girl to like them, fall in love with them, and then get them to perform whatever they want to do out of basis of love and take care of them. And then the girl will hopefully be able to service enough customers or make enough money that she won't have to do that anymore, that he'll love her enough. And so they use these techniques now because we're finding fewer girls actually trying to escape, and when we do meet them, they're unwilling to leave because they say, the guy really loves me, or I'm almost going to pay my debt off and I can go free. We don't need to get out yet. Other ways they control them is threats of telling family or posting pictures on the internet. In many countries, it's a dishonor. I was in Turkey last year, and it's a dishonor to basically be exploited. And so you've heard of honor killings, I'm sure. There's a lot of honor killings in the eastern part of Turkey because these girls have been basically raped by family members or somebody else, and then they're taken out and killed because they're no longer valuable. But now the families, and the fathers particularly, are figuring out, hey, instead of killing her, we can make some money. So now they sell her to traffickers. They get the honor back because you're no longer part of the family, but they can still make money at the same time. And then threats of being arrested as a criminal. If you're being trafficked into the U.S. without the proper paperwork, they use that as a threat that immigration will come after you, you'll be arrested and locked up and put in jail. And so they use those also as coercive measures to keep control of the victims. So what can be done to stop it? When you talk about trafficking and slavery, you got to talk about supply and demand. And you've heard many groups. One group wants to talk about targeting the demand side. If we just make awareness, we stop the demand, we can stop the trafficking. We need to stop the demand for sexual exploitation, stop the demand for cheap labor. We can actually stop trafficking. Another group wants to target the supply side. If we can educate the vulnerable people, we can give them sustainable lifestyles, we can do something more to offer them, then we can stop the supplies that are going in, and we can stop the trafficking that way. I'm afraid we're never going to be able to stop the demand for sexual exploitation of women and children around the world. And we're never going to be able to stop the demand for cheap labor to be able to build the products by unscrupulous business owners. Human trafficking and slavery is a very profitable business, third only behind trafficking of narcotics and arms sales. And so we have to do something about stopping the profitability of the business. You have to attack the network. Henry Louis Gates, a Harvard chair of African and African American studies, stated, without a complex business partnerships between African elites, European traders, and commercial agents, the slave trade to the New World would have been impossible, at least on the scale it occurred. They had a sophisticated, organized network then, and it has even gotten better now through the ages, through the technology, through the sophistication. It's become more of a transnational organized network. And so products and profits. By attacking the supply chain, we can reduce or eliminate the organization's ability to actually make a profit, thereby forcing them out of business. Just like you would attack a Walmart or a Target. You wouldn't necessarily go to the store and clean the products off the shelves because they're going to restock it. You got to go up and attack the supply chain. You got to dismantle that supply chain so they can't get the products to the store. If they can't get the products, they can't sell, they can't make a product, and can't buy more. It's all a finance. How many businesses are going to stay in business if they're not making a profit? They're eventually going to go out of business. And so making the exploitation of others more risky as well, and costly in terms of fines and jail sentences, can also improve the impact of our efforts. Punishing those who exploit others and proactively targeting them more effectively. And then currently, human trafficking is a low-risk, high-reward venture. There's not a whole lot of arrests. If you look at the number of convictions around the world today, it's very small if all. But yet it is so prevalent around here. Like I said, it happens in every state, but we don't have convictions in every state. So it's a relatively easy business to get into. You can make a lot of money. And so what's to prevent people from getting into it? We've got to turn the stakes and make it into a high-risk, low-reward venture. where it's more dangerous for them to get involved in this, and the risks involved are going to be greater, and the rewards are going to be smaller. And ultimately, there is no simple solution. There's no one solution. It will take a concerted effort from all stakeholders involved, from governments, law enforcement, non-government organizations, healthcare workers, educators. Everybody has to get involved and get involved in some form of aspect of how we can defeat these networks. You must get involved now. You guys are the future. You guys are going to be bringing this forward. I've met with many college students around the country, talked with them. They're the passionate leaders of tomorrow. You guys have to take this on as a burden and bring it to the next level. Thank you. Switch chairs.
Switch chair.
Just switch chairs.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and let me say thank you to David Ives and Mohammed Bey and the Schweitzer Institute for putting this panel together. At first, when David invited me to speak, I declined, claiming that I'm not a U.S. history expert. I work on the Caribbean. I work, yes, on slavery and emancipation in the Caribbean, and it has very little to do immediately with the United States. But I'm very pleased that David insisted that I talk today, because the more I thought about what I would say, I saw the overlaps, and I'm really very pleased that I'd be able to share my work today. And so the title of my talk, Emancipation and Its Discontents, Celebrations, Commemorations, and New Histories. And my talk is very much an academic talk, but it also speaks somewhat to my own involvement in 2007 with the commemoration for the 200th year of the abolition of the slave trade to the British colonies. And what I'll talk about today is how how popular culture thinks about abolition and emancipation as a moment for celebration. But as an academic, as a historian, we often see these moments in very different terms. So my talk will focus on those concerns. I have my cell phone not because I'm waiting for a call, but I like to time myself, so I have a sense of where I am, and I could sort of wrap up when the time comes. Oops. Thank you. Okay, there we go. Historians are ambivalent about anniversaries at best, and at worst, rarely see them as happy occasions to celebrate. For historians, anniversaries are moments for contemplation, deep reflection, and an occasion to do what we do best, rewrite history, to reevaluate our conceptions of history and economic, political, and social development. This is especially true of anniversaries relating to the abolition of slavery in various international contexts. Taking the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation as a starting point, its passing is one of the most celebrated moments, not just in American history, but world history. Its architect, President Abraham Lincoln, rose and continues to rise as one of the most celebrated presidents in history, in history, who not only freed the slaves, but was a martyr in the cause of liberty. Over the decades, and now a full century and a half, since the 1863 proclamation, historians have asked, what exactly did the Emancipation Act mean for the people it aimed to free? And most recently, with the release of Steven Spielberg's popular film, Lincoln, what role did African Americans play in securing their own freedom? But well before the momentous events of 1863, the British humanitarians and Britain were martyrs in the cause of Black liberation. In 1807, Britain took the first steps in the long walk to ending slavery in her colonies when on March 25th, it passed an act for the abolition of the slave trade. Writing in 1869, W.E.H. Leakey argued that the 1807 Act was probably one of the most perfectly virtuous pages comprised in the history of nations. Virtuous, later historian David Ryan explains, implies no hidden agenda or ulterior motives, even if England did very little to widen opportunities for emancipated slaves and their descendants. If one doubted virtue, the lack of underlying motives, as sufficient reason to celebrate Britain passing the 1807 Act, then Seymour Drescher's work, Econicide, take a note of the title, should erase all doubts. Implicit in Drescher's coining of the phrase econicide was the idea that the abolition of the slave trade was comparable to committing suicide for a major part of Britain's economy. Loaded with statistical tables and organized like a lawyer's brief, as David puts it, Econicide demonstrated and argued that the British slave system was expanding and increasing in value at the time it ended the slave trade. So, like a sacrificial lamb to the slaughter, Britain simply gave up her involvement in the transatlantic slave trade because it was contrary to the laws of God and the laws of men. The 1807 Act has therefore been a moment of celebration and jubilation in respect to British virtue and self-sacrifice. And for these reasons, in the year 2007, that marked the 200th year anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade, the British celebrated their accomplishments. Descendants from the African victims of the transatlantic slave trade neither viewed Britain as virtuous, self-sacrificing, nor 2007 as a moment to celebrate. In the words of Vereen Shepherd, renowned historian, activist, and chair of the 2007 Jamaica National Bicentenary Committee, the bicentennial has hardly been embraced by all as a celebratory event in the history of the African Atlantic. It's a moment for commemoration, re-evaluation, and education. Commemoration, Barry Higman notes, urges opportunities for public expression of pride and apology, regret, and nostalgia. Key among the regrets from Jamaica, the Caribbean, and the wider African diaspora was Britain's underlying economic and nationalist motives for ending her involvement in the slave trade. One of the first challengers of the altruistic humanitarian revolution framework for interpreting and writing about the 1807 Act came in 1944 with Eric Williams's hard-hitting, bold, incisive, and immensely provocative work, Capitalism and Slavery. Capitalism and Slavery established the centrality of African slavery and the slave trade to the English economy, challenging the traditional view that the colonies were mere recipients of metropolitan benevolence and less the principal agents in the construction of the imperial power's prosperity. Williams's historical materialism left generations of scholars looking beyond the good feelings that the 1807 Act provoked to examine deeper the economic ramifications of the trade both before and after its prohibition, the ethical, intellectual, and religious criticisms of the trade, the role of mass organization and protest rebellion against slavery and the slave trade. Of immediate concern for my talk today or this evening is that 1807 merely ended British involvement in the slave trade, but it did not end slavery. Apologists for slavery and the slave trade and celebrants for the 1807 Act divert attention from the historical fact that enslaved people in the British colonies would have to wait another 3 decades before they were legally free. So if the 1807 Act was truly virtuous and meant to liberate Africans and their descendants, why such a long delay? Historians have explained this postponement in several ways, and I will highlight 3 of these reasons. One is that by directly attacking slavery, abolitionists would interfere with property rights or property ownership in slaves, and slaveholders would view parliamentary attempts to abolish slavery as an attack on property rights an infringement on the liberties of English men. As historian Roger Ainstie explains, compensation for property would have had to accompany legislations against slavery. At the end of the 18th century, a fiscally strapped parliament would be reluctant to bear the inordinate costs of compensating West Indian planters. Thus, concludes Ainstie, ending the slave trade was the best financial strategy in laying the axe at the very root of slavery. Second, the ease with which abolitionists could acquire evidence of the brutalities and human costs of the horrid Middle Passage made condemning the slave trade far more promising than denouncing slavery. Historian David Ryden explains, the slave trade was a relatively easy study because the human cost was quantifiable. Annual estimates of the number of slaves, the numbers of deaths, and the numbers of women and children on board a ship could be tabulated, while a similar morbidity and mortality figures for the Caribbean would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to collect. So while the image of the poor treatment of an isolated plantation slave might be potentially heart-wrenching, the horror of a slave ship was irritable. The data lent credibility to the image of Africans packed tightly like sardines in order to maximize return for greedy slave merchants. And the image that I have, the two images that I have here are two key abolitionist images. This image here to your right is the single isolated image, which was not provocative enough to cause abolitionists to campaign for the ending of of slavery. But the one to your left is sort of the image that most of us are quite familiar with, which shows hundreds of Africans tacked idly on a ship. So the argument is that it was more strategic to campaign for an ending of the slave trade rather than an ending of slavery. The third reason is that abolitionists imbibed and extended the racist theories of their day and argued that Africans and their descendants in the New World were not ready for freedom. In the words of abolitionist James Ramsey, "Our slaves are not yet generally in a state where full liberty would be a blessing. Like children, they must be restrained by authority and led to their own good." So ultimately, abolitionists believed that ending the slave trade and not slavery would provide a proprietary period for masters and slaves. With their supplies from Africa severed, slaveholders would have to treat their slaves with greater humanity. By mitigating punishment, reducing their workloads, attending to their health and material welfare, and facilitating Christian conversion and education, masters would bring about the natural death to slavery, and slaves would acquire civilized habits of free people. Historians have defined this period between the rise of anti-slavery activism and the ending of slavery, roughly 1788 to 1834, as the ameliorative era, so called because it is a time in which slaveholders were said to have improved enslaved people's conditions. For many scholars, amelioration has been a question of improvement. Were slaves better off or more humanely treated because of planter reforms? One perspective by historians like Barbara Bush, and no, this is not the president's wife, Lucille Mayer, among others, is that amelioration made no difference in the lives of the enslaved. In the penultimate years of slavery, their lives left much to be desired. Women continued working in the fields and subject to harsh punishment just as before. I, however, argue that it's a very limited perspective to view amelioration as a linear progression from cruelty towards kindness. This assumes one is exclusive of the other. The reality was less than a neat progression from a brutal system of slavery towards a new age humanitarian system. Enhancement in women's material conditions aimed at securing their manual labor while shoring up their abilities to birth future generations of enslaved laborers. Moreover, the main question was not whether or not women should not be whether or not women were immune from hard labor. the meaning of labor itself must be revisited and redefined in order for us to appreciate the transformation in enslaved women's daily lives, and secondly, to be able to explain the precise nature of those transformations. Now, the second part of my presentation will look at some of the changes in labor that these women experience. And I do this by looking at a series of sugar plantations in Jamaica. And I've given you some of those plantations that I look at, so to give you a sense of some of those plantations across various parts of Jamaica. I will examine these transformations by critically examining plantation journals and estate correspondence for several Jamaican estates where planters reassigned women from hard or severe tasks to easy ones. At Denby and Thomas River Estates, overseers rearranged women from working in jobs that required heavy lifting, and usually jobs that required heavy lifting revolved around the planting of sugarcane, the cutting of sugar cane, or the hulling, which is preparing the cane piece for cultivation. So whether they were weeding cane fields, carrying canes to the mill, or removing its residual trash, planters calculated that these various tasks were either heavy or light. And so they questioned whether or not women could adequately or could perform these labor roles without injuring their abilities to reproduce. So the challenge in this period is to explore how much could we push our slave laborers or female slave laborers to work without injuring their abilities to reproduce. So this is the calculations that planters are actually working on. So at least a few planters agreed that it was more difficult to carry canes and therefore assigned young lads to such tasks. At Lord Penryn's Clarendon Properties, its overseer planted young lads to carry canes, while pregnant women were assigned to, quote, easier tasks. Female trash carriers did not uniformly receive reassignment. In looking at the records for Denby and Thomas River Estates, for example, it is clear that the overseer simply replaced women who carried cane trash with younger lads. At other estates like Kings Valley, the overseer was more critical in his analysis of whether women could in fact continue carrying trash despite their pregnancies. So rather than adapting a blanket approach, David Ewart, the overseer, placed women in labor roles according to how far they had to travel with the cane trash. Women at Kings Valley continued to carry cane trash because Ewart believed that the distance between the mill house and the trash house was a very moderate one. And the mill house is typically the part of the sugar estate where the canes, I'll show you an image here, typically the part of the sugar estate where the canes are milled to extract its juice. So the calculation is, did women have to travel very far distances between the mill house, for example, and the trash house? And the argument is that if women were not traveling very far, then these women could continue to carry trash because they didn't have to travel very far, so it was not injurious to their abilities to reproduce. So David Ewart reasoned that pregnant trash carriers at Kings Valley needed only limited alterations on their labor, since the trash was also dry and rather lightweight. Women who were in later stages of their pregnancies did not carry trash alone. Instead, women worked in pairs to ensure that one assisted the other. The most difficult and potentially dangerous aspect of carrying trash was in stooping down to pick up the basket. Ewart therefore placed women in pairs to ensure that one assisted the other when stooping down to pick up the basket. Ewart took a similar approach for mill workers. Rather than work as individuals, mill feeders worked in pairs to supply canes to the mill. During harvesting season, mills were kept in constant production to ensure that canes were cut and milled in order to prevent fermentation. So instead of having women work on extended shifts as individuals, pregnant women worked in pairs, allowing one to rest while the other fed canes to the mill. So alternating between feeders ensured that the mill remained in constant production, and expectant mothers received a little bit of time off during work. Ewart calculated that allowing women to rest throughout the workday would be less injurious to their breeding without losing their labor power. So understanding these labor reassignments are critical for explaining gender roles and the meaning of reproductive labor inaugurated by abolitionist activism and the emergence of new ideas about Black women's bodies. Women's childbearing abilities were of comparable importance to skilled labor. Before the rise of abolitionist activism, only artisans and skilled laborers were spared from field work. This, however, changed during the so-called ameliorative era. Like skilled artisans who were exempt from field work in order to work in their artisanal capacities, prospective mothers were similarly spared. Bearing children was an ability only a few women possessed, and slaveholders sought to maximize this by placing expectant mothers with young male workers. Slaveholders therefore instituted a new gender division of labor and at the same time placed new value on enslaved women's reproductive capacity. Indeed, there is no objective standard for assessing what constituted easy or less strenuous work for a woman with child. And instead of continued dismissal that women's work roles remain unchanged, or that abolitionists inaugurated humanitarian treatment of women, I further explore how their labor roles varied from light to heavy according to stages of pregnancy. And in doing this, I explore the writings of various plantation doctors. Enslaved women were increasingly subjected to doctors' speculations on what constituted appropriate work during their pregnancy. Doctors such as Benjamin Turney, who had permanent residence at Golden Grove Estate in Jamaica, and general practitioners who were also professional planters and doctors, such as David Collins, not only managed women's labor on the ground, but also published their practices as general guidelines on how to efficiently regulate women's roles to maximize their breeding without losing too much labor in the fields. And this is just to give you an example of one of the medical publications that we're seeing emerging, not just in Jamaica, but across the Caribbean. And in this particular slide, I'll just draw your attention to some of the key topics that plantation doctors were discussing. They're talking about breeding, which is speaking specifically to enslaved women, and of course, how do we treat certain complications that arise among pregnant women, such as falling down of the womb, and of course, how to deal with the problem of abortion. In this case, more spontaneous miscarriage as a result of women not being able to balance the exploitative work of the plantation with now having to bear children once the slave trade comes to an end. Women under the care of plantation doctors were subject to a variety of regulations. Those under Dr. William Sells's care continued in their usual labor with no alteration until they were 4 or 5 months advanced in pregnancy. At such time, a lighter employment was substituted in which they continued until they delivered their children. Expectant mothers under Dr. Collins's care were, however, subject to greater regulations according to the progression of their pregnancies. In the first 4 months of gestation, when the stomach is harassed with sickness, they were favored with occasional remission from work. They were permitted to remain in the sick house until such time when their conditions improved. Not all women received this exemption, however. Only those who checked themselves into the doctor's care were excused from labor. As a general rule, all women known to be pregnant under Dr. Collins's care were exempt from all kinds of labor which required extraordinary exertions or required them to carry heavy loads such as carrying or cutting canes. They continued in tasks such as weeding and hoeing cane holes once they could do so without strain or injury to their pregnancy. Additionally, their working spaces were limited to parts of the property where they did not have to travel down steep or descending or slippery hills, especially during the rainy months. Further alterations were made in the last 6 to 8 weeks of pregnancy when, as Dr. Collins described it, the weight and pressures of the child disables her from moving without uneasiness or difficulty. At this point, they were again reassigned to even lighter roles among grass gang, where they were assigned with the task of bringing bundles of grass for use by the stock. So in essence, pregnant women were never fully exempt from labor, perhaps as abolitionists and observers have noted and historians have correctly argued. However, their labor responsibilities shifted according to what doctors calculated were suitable for their various stages of pregnancy and what would not cause planters to lose their labor in the fields. We can agree that the ending of the slave trade was a watershed moment in the lives of enslaved women as planters developed practical working solutions according to their subjective assessment of what constituted hard or easy tasks, and speculations on women's abilities and advancement in pregnancies, and the overall effects of changing women's labor assignment on plantation productivity. The resultant amelioration of slavery was not one of improved conditions, but rather the introduction of new systems of domination that enabled planters to exploit enslaved women more effectively. From a variety of perspectives, we can agree that carrying trash is easier or was easier than carrying cane. Yet this reduction of labor must necessarily be seen in light of the ultimate goal it served: birthing future laborers to shore up the plantation economy, because abolitionists, after all, were concerned with the economic ramifications of ending slavery. So enslaved women's children were not meant to be expressions of love, affection, or affirmation of their humanity or social values. From a much larger perspective then, in the age of humanitarianism, slavery gradually transitioned from a dependence on overt, unfocused brutality to more subtle, calculated methods of control and domination. And enslaved women's lives hung in the balance of abolitionist, humanitarian, and economic interests. So in this context, let us view the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation as a moment to reflect and reevaluate historical decision-making, not as a moment for celebration or good feeling, but as lessons for current and future policies. Thank you.
Good evening, faculty and students. My name is Nina Brandy. I am a sophomore nursing major here at Quinnipiac, and I'm here tonight to tell you about a nonprofit organization known as Restovac Freedom Alliance. RFA is an organization that works to offer a safe, family-centered environment for former Restovac children in Haiti. Restovac Freedom Alliance currently has 2 homes in Chantal and Ducis, with a total of 32 strong, beautiful children. I would like to share with you my involvement as a missionary with this incredible organization. It would not have been possible without the support and love of 2 of the most important people in my life, my mom and my dad. All their hard work and compassion has truly been an inspiration in all that I do, and for them I am so thankful. Thank you also to David Ives for asking me to be here today. Tonight I want to paint a picture of the experiences these children have endured. They have had such a profound effect on my life, and I hope I can give you a glimpse of the passion I have to serve these people. I'm going to try not to get emotional, because last time I did. Try and imagine yourself in a place where you cannot afford to have 3 meals a day. No breakfast, no lunch, and no dinner. Maybe you have some rice in the afternoon, but that's it. Imagine having many other brothers and sisters who you have to share your small meal with every day. Imagine being in a place where it is nearly impossible to find clean drinking water unless you buy it from a vendor or are lucky enough to live close enough to a clean well. Soon your mom realizes that you are in danger. You are sick and have a constant hunger. They send you away to a place where you are put with a family who says they will feed you and take care of you. You never see your mom, dad, brothers, and sisters ever again. You are sent to live with a family who has other children, but those children go to school. You, on the other hand, do not. You have entered into this home thinking your life would be better, but truthfully, it is much worse. You become a slave. You are a Restvek. Your days are long. They consist of carrying heavy water buckets on your head back and forth, and going to the market to buy things for the family you are with. One day, on your way to the market, someone bigger than you, probably older than you, who is also in need of food, steals your money. You are scared and you don't know how to defend yourself, so you run to your home in tears. You return to the family you are staying with and try to explain to them what happened. They are angry, so angry. They threaten you, beat you, and punish you. At the end of the day, you are hungry, hurting, and sad. While the other children come home from school, you are not treated as they are. Instead, you are yelled at. You go to your place where you sleep, in the dirt on the floor. You are 7 years old. You are a Restvek. You do not have a childhood. You have no personal belongings, no electronics, no clean clothes, no shoes, no shower, no food. You can't read, you can't write, you have never even been to school. And you are deprived of one of the most essential things a human being needs, love. This is the life of many children in Haiti, actually about 225,000 children. In May of 2012, I went on my first trip to Haiti. We began our journey traveling through Port-au-Prince, and our destination was Les Cayes, where we would be staying in the mission house of Pastor John Beausejour and his wife Gardinette. During the ride from Port-au-Prince to Les Cayes, I was slowly taking in everything that I saw. Many of the people still lived in makeshift tent communities since the earthquake. Women, men of all ages, carrying gigantic sacks or baskets on their head with perfected balance. Some almost twice their size. I was completely amazed. When on the plane, a woman who looked around 75 hurled a huge piece of luggage, about the size of like a hockey bag, and carried it over her shoulder. When asked if she needed help, she replied simply with no. She was tough. She looked tough, but not in a scary or mean way, tough as in hardworking and determined. During the trip through Port-au-Prince, I saw this look on so many of the faces of the people that live there. Countless umbrellas with vendors, a few smiles, but not many. I saw small children oblivious to the poverty around them, men bathing outside in their shorts with a bucket of water and a rag, a small team of Haitian boys and men playing a soccer game outside, and lastly, there was trash covering the road in the gray, dirty, flowing water that was everywhere. We stopped along the way to buy some mangoes from girls who were selling them along the street. They had to be about 15 to 16 years old. Again, amazing me. So much of a different lifestyle than I grew up in. It was different, a different culture. Not weird, just different. Very eye-opening. I have learned that truthfully we shouldn't fear what is different, because that is what holds us back from being fully alive. Fear only brings doubt, and doubt holds us back. I learned that life is an adventure, a path that many people think should be perfect, but really it's the places we encounter, bumps and curves that make us into the person that we are intended to be. This is the circle of life. To see unfamiliar things, different cultures, connects the human race and makes us one. It is hope that gives me strength to know that in the simple act of reaching out a hand, a difference can be made. And I've learned that it does not matter how small. Restvek Freedom Alliance is dedicated to providing relief for the Restvek children, children who are given to families and used as slaves in Haiti. Our mission is to offer a safe, stable, family-centered environment for these children. Slaves are people who are forced to work without pay or getting only enough to survive for someone else's profit and completely controlled by violence or threat of violence. Slavery takes many forms, including child labor and the Restovec system. RFA has created a home of refugee set up with the pastor's families as the supporting parents. Each child has access to an education, medical support, loving care, psychiatric care, and adequate food, clean water, and sanitary facilities. Most importantly, each child will have access to both love and a childhood. Slavery affects people differently, depending in part on their age, how long they are in slavery, and how badly they are treated. But all slaves have had their basic human rights taken away by lies and violence and have suffered great harm. All children have the right to live in freedom. They need time to recover in a helpful environment, and they need to get their feet under them before they can start life again. Rehabilitation is a long process that helps a former Restovec find his or her mental balance again and become part of a group. Our children have learned to survive in terrible conditions, to work extremely hard, and to keep on going through pain and illness. But they have also been very deeply damaged in many ways. They especially have not had the conditions for normal growth and psychological development. We aim to rebuild the lives of these children by means of empowering them and helping them to find their own abilities and strength. It also requires that we heal their physical and emotional wounds as far as possible. But the terrible effects of slavery on victims can never fully be undone. Ending the cultural condition of the Restovec is completely our goal. Our home consists of children who are searching for freedom. Chantal and Ducis are the two locations of RFA's home of refugee. When we opened the first RFA home in 2010 and the second home very recently in 2012, there were several factors that needed to be considered. One of the first things that was done was to treat the sickness and injuries of our children through physical examinations. I'm going to be showing a video shortly, and the beginning of the video has pictures of the children from when they first boarded the bus to freedom. And if you want, you'll most likely be able to tell the differences in their health state because they look very thin and scared in the picture, and throughout the video you'll see their progress. Where was I? So, sickness and injuries. During this rehabilitation, the children were taught the domestic skills of keeping a home and its environment clean. They learned and continue to learn the importance of health and sanitation. And most importantly, these children learned that they have as many rights as any other person. The progress these kids have made is absolutely incredible. Once scared, shy, reserved, and untrusting, these children now laugh and are treated with respect. They are taught what it means to be kind and what it means to have rights and the importance of an education. They treat each other like brothers and sisters. Volunteers provide the kids with fun activities, English lessons, trips to the beach, and in August we even built a soccer field. We bring them clothes, soccer balls, and games to play, but most importantly, we give these children the love that they were so deprived of. These children have shown me that blood is not necessarily what connects you, and communication is something that can be exchanged without speaking the same language. I feel connection with these children, stronger than anything I have ever felt before. And words are barely exchanged. It was the laughter, especially at my multiple failing attempts to speak Creole. The smiles, the jokes, the hugs, I could go on forever. They have truly become part of my family. This December, I met the children of RFA's new home in Ducis for the first time. The children had been there for a little over a month or so, and it is truly a day I will remember for the rest of my life. Tiny feet ran towards the car, with extending arms craving an embrace. I saw smiles spread farther than the miles we traveled, beautifully captivating distant eyes, gazing up at me, singing thousands of verses of songs that I may never completely understand. These are my first moments in Ducis. My eyes were filled with tears. I was overwhelmed with an indescribable compassion and joy. I was completely and utterly in love with these children. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. Sorry. I smiled. held and kissed each and every one of their little faces, and told them that they were beautiful and that I loved them. A kiss is something healing and reassuring. As a child, a kiss can fix an injury, it can stop tears, it says hello, goodbye, good morning, good night, and thank you. But most importantly, a kiss is an expression of love that seems to say, I am here, I love you, I care for you, and everything is going to be just fine. I just melted before these children. I wanted them to know that they are loved by not only me, but by their new family, and most importantly, God Himself. The home in Ducis and Chantal are homes where miracles are made. Love has the power to move mountains, create pathways to new life, and give opportunity. Love makes a family complete and forms a bond like no other. And love plants the seed of inspiration that could drive people to have the passion to make a difference. These children, once in darkness, now have a new opportunity at life, a childhood free from the bonds of hurt and despair that they were once faced with. They can now burn bright and blossom into incredible individuals. They are loved, and each home is blessed with two unbelievable parents with hearts that burst with immeasurable kindness and affection. Those little running feet have ran straight into my heart, and for them, I am forever grateful. The songs that these children's eyes sang have created a miracle within me. They have taught me that through looking at life through the vulnerable eyes of a child, the love of Christ can be seen in the most unbelievable ways. Thank you. I have a little video.
From the day we arrive on the planet and blinking step into the sun, there's more to see than can ever be seen, more to do than can ever be done. There's far too much to take in here, more to find than can ever be found. But the sun rolling high through the sapphire sky keeps great and small on the endless
Pasa nakalala. Yeah.
Italia non ti visto.
from Senegal, West Africa, to St. Louis, Missouri. Thanks to Catherine Dunham for giving my pops his glory. He came down with his drum and a dream to change the world in a free, uplifting world. And that's all he ever wanted. Mom came a little after, gave birth to my brother, and then all of the pressure made them fight one another. You see, the pain will never last. Did the best with what they had. He knew the world was out for grabs, and he searched to find his freedom. Everything I own, all my mistakes, fam, you already know. I wanna be free. I wanna be free. So I search to find my freedom. Oh, freedom. Everything I have, everything I own, all my mistakes, girl, you already know. I wanna be free. I wanna be free, yeah. As a kid, I never knew I'd have to hustle just to make it through. So I found myself skipping school, cause the girls don't think I'm cool. And because of that, I didn't care whether or not I went to jail. I just wanna be treated fair, cause that's all I ever knew. Telling me I need to slow down, it's everybody in the whole time, cause they know how I get down. Far enough from another town. Can you believe we still around after so many hit the ground? And we ain't gonna stop now until we get that freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Everything I have, everything I own, all my mistakes, fam, you already know. I wanna be free. I wanna be free. Won't stop till I find my freedom. My freedom. My freedom. Oh, freedom. Everything I have, everything I own, all my mistakes, girl, you already know.
I love you.
Put your hands up. Put your hands up. If you wanna be free from all your misery, put your hands up. Put your hands up. If you wanna be free with plenty money, put your hands up. Put your hands up. If you wanna be free, just praise G.O.D. Put your hands up. Put your hands up.
Join me in thanking our panel again.